Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Detonation. In the house, we have John Kurtz and Daniel Yelishvili. These are two, John, you're the candidate for the USTP, and Daniel, you're our valued climate change expert, basically. You're about to get your degree. It's so exciting. We can't wait for that to happen. We're talking about carbon sequestration last time, weather warfare, and a whole bunch of other stuff. But this time, we want to just concentrate on climate change solutions. And, to do that, I want to ask you guys, is there a climate crisis? But before we do that, welcome John, welcome Daniel, in that order. Introduce yourself. Go, John. Introduce yourself.
I'm John, and John Carrots, and I've been on here twice before. It's always great to talk to you, Steele, and thanks for having me back.
Thank you, John. And what are you doing again, John? You're running?
No, right now I'm sitting, but no, I am a potential candidate. I am a candidate for the presidency for the Transhumanistic Party, and seeing how that's going. I'm glad to have the opportunity to speak to people through your show.
Cool, thanks. And Daniel, how are you? Who are you? Thank you.
I'm great, thank you. It's great to be here again. I wear many hats. This is something I didn't mention last time, but I'm on the California Young Democrats. It's an organization for Democrats in the United States, ages 18 to 35. And I'm the vice chair of the California Young Democrats Jewish Caucus. But I'm here today because I'm a contributing author to the Transhumanism Handbook, in which I wrote the chapter Geoengineering, Approaching Climate Change as a Present-Day Preventable Issue. Now, my expertise is in political science. I understand how countries work, how legislation works, and how states work. But the thing about political science is that it gets connected to other sciences. For example, climate science and its future are controlled by political scientists, and more specifically, politicians and elected officials. So that's what I'm here to talk about today.
All right, thank you. That's a great introduction, and I'd invite you on just for the Democratic part, not just because of Newton Lee. It's all valued. I did geopolitics and political science myself as well, so so I have a lot of respect for that field. Although I know how incredibly it's drained the swamp. Like, it's by definition, it is a swamp. But anyway, it's fantastic to have you both on. It's really, really good, and we're going to march into some climate change questions. So, John, you go, launch away. What's your official campaign stance, and/or what's your personal feelings? Is there a climate change problem, and what does that problem look like?
Well, yes, I very much believe there's a problem. It bothers me that people seem to want to deny that there's a problem, but I guess we've talked before. A lot of things I think today are motivated by money and greed, and I would also hope, as I brought up before, we talk about longevity, and I think if some people that are right now greedy for the money, if they realize they might be here longer, they might actually care more about the environment in the future. Because I think a lot of people think, well, I'm going to get rich now, it's going to be fine for my life, probably my kids' lives, and past that, I don't care. But I think they don't realize a lot of what they're doing is adding up faster than they've thought. And like earlier, before we came on, we mentioned the Amazon and how that there's kind of shenanigans going on there, and how a lot of it is based on greed, I think, and the government itself. And how the president of the country wants the land developed and destroyed so that they can do other things for it and make more money off it. He doesn't really care about the environment. He kind of seems to me like he's caring about the quick buck. So I think a lot of our destruction is based on people wanting money and not caring about the future.
Daniel, is there a climate change issue, and what does it look like?
Yes, not only is there a climate change issue at present, as of 2016, as I've written in the Transhumanism Handbook, it has become so severe that it cannot reverse itself naturally. The natural cleansing processes of the Earth are no longer sufficient as a means of renewing the climate cycles of the planet, because artificial intervention in the greenhouse gas composition of the atmosphere is so severe And we have contributed as a species. Humanity has contributed so severely to pollution that we can no longer reverse climate change without artificial intervention. And that's why I argue for various forms of geoengineering, especially carbon sequestration and carbon capture technology.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and that's your very famous PowerPoint that's floating around with the 400 parts per million and how we've breached that, massively. So, very entertain this idea very quickly. Is it global warming, global cooling, or is it something else to do with the solar flares and all that sort of stuff? John, is it global warming, global cooling, or something else? And then Daniel.
Well, that is a good thing. Some of the stuff I've been reading and watching lately says it's kind of a mixture and all things are interacting. And I think the interaction is the part we have to watch also when we try to solve it. The system, I think, is more delicate than we think. We think the system, we always go, oh, well, the Earth will take care of it. But I think we've messed it up to the point that we have to very delicately try to tweak it to get it back to where it goes and through our intervention. So I think it's a relationship of all three things. And finding the proper balance of how to regulate it and bring it back is the difficult part.
So it's warming and cooling at the same time, is that what you're saying?
Yes, there's different things that affect both things. And it was interesting because I was reading something the other day where they said, well, if we cut out everything we're doing right now, that'll cut back on the reflectiveness in the atmosphere, which will heat us up even more. And that also is a possibility. It's a very delicate, our planet and its atmosphere is more delicate than we realize. And we've kind of mucked with it too long. It's going to be a delicate thing to set it back.
All right, Daniel, is it warming or is it cooling or is it something else?
That depends on the scale at which we assess the Earth's atmospheric composition. There's a difference between weather change, as in the clouds in the sky coming and going, and climate change, as in the overall global temperature of the Earth. Let me give you an example. Climate change has been increasing more and more over the past century or so, and especially within the past 50 years. This has come about largely due to unfettered excesses of the third industrial revolution. Now, here's the thing. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're not going to see snow. There was a pretty famous, or rather infamous, segment on Fox News a while back where Al Gore, former presidential candidate and author of An Inconvenient Truth, was made fun of when some Fox News anchors went outside one winter afternoon, held up a snowball, and started laughing. They said, "Ha, see, this is your global warming. What kind of warming is this?" Well, here's the thing. Much like an actual greenhouse, the greenhouse effect on Earth is interfering with the natural processes of the Earth's various global ecosystems, where in one part of the world, for example, you might have a region that's traditionally colder. The Arctic is a good example. Another is a region that is traditionally warmer. A good example of that is the Amazon rainforest. So what we're seeing is that globally, we see a greenhouse effect, which on a micro level, on a smaller scale, is causing weather change. So that means that a side effect of global warming is extreme weather, which ironically may cause increased snowstorms and hurricanes.
Yeah, the greenhouse effect is an important issue to talk about. And this is why I guess you would be an advocate of carbon capture to alleviate that issue. Because the more we rock the climate, of course, the more unstable it becomes, and then there's a feedback loop there. So that's really cool. All right, so I guess my next question is, let's talk about some of these, like the biodiversity, like the ecological holocaust that's going on, because that's part of it. Biological systems. John, do you see a way? Do you see that there is an environmental eco holocaust going on in terms of natural wildlife, bacteria, the species depletion, and all these other things. And does that have an impact on the climate?
Well, I think, yeah, it will have an effect on climate. But my concern sometimes that I think that people don't realize about climate changes too is it affects diseases and pathogens and stuff and their growth and how they spread and stuff too. And people don't think about that. So it's not just the climate and affecting weather, but it's going to affect other things on this planet that might like it being warmer, and it could cause us to have more epidemics of diseases that we never thought about before from a different cause. I think that's an important issue to also think about that I think a lot of people are overlooking.
Daniel Ellis-Philly, ecological holocaust, is it happening, and does that actually impact the climate?
Well, here's the thing. The greatest victim, the greatest species in the crossfires of the sniper rifle of climate change, as it were, is certainly various species. It's certainly amphibians, which have been disproportionately affected by changes in the weather due to their sensitive physiological composition. The greatest victim of climate change is humanity. The human race is adapting very poorly to changes in the climate. We have a lot of jobs and a lot of populations that are at risk due to global resource depletion and an increasing lack of food security. Basically, we're having more and more difficulty on a global scale finding sustainable, healthy, and easily reproducible sources of food. This is particularly affecting the Asian continent, which relies, in many cases, heavily on income from agriculture. And, well, I'll put it simply, you can't depend on agriculture when your crop annually, year by year, is getting smaller and smaller. So perhaps hypothetically in the future, a lot of animals that are at risk right now will become healthier and thrive. Humanity is not one of those animals. So if I were talking to someone, for example, who is skeptical about the reality of climate change or skeptical about the severity of climate change, I would make sure to say that the greatest threat is to us, it's to humanity. And of course, I personally care about saving the whales and so forth. When we stop climate change, we save the humans.
Yeah, that's very good. So, John, my next question is...
Yes, I did. Let me interject something here, something that Dan made me think of. Talking about the crops is the fact that some of my reading on that is the fact that our crops are very susceptible to temperature change also, and that affects us, and that we should be, and we've kind of bred our crops and engineered our crops for a certain kind of temperatures, and they're not resilient to the temperature change. And we have to, one of the things we have to do if we want to survive with this is to alter our crops and breed some slightly different crops. And people always are against us engineering crops, but man has been engineering crops from way back. I mean, corn didn't even look like what it looks like today. It looked more like wheat in the old days, and carrots and potatoes didn't look like they do. We've altered crops since we've been farming. But the fact that the temperatures change, it affects our crops because our crops are made for the temperature ranges that our different countries have and stuff. And if we don't do something to change that in the meantime too, that could be a way our human beings won't be able to be fed. I mean, potatoes, when we spread potatoes years ago, I always thought of potatoes as a filler food. It's high in starch, it's easy, they throw it in food because it's cheap. We had a friend of mine that was a chef. He said, it's not the way you should think of potatoes. Years ago, people would have starved if it wasn't for potatoes. It was a cheap, easy food to grow. And with the climate changing, think of the foods that we're not going to be able to grow properly. I forget what it was, but I've seen some things in the news where places that grew different crops before have changed over to altered the crops. Of course, when they were asked if there's a climate change, they say, oh, no, there's always been climate shifts. Yes, there's always been climate shifts, but not as much as there is now. That's what people don't realize. So I'm sorry. What was your next question then, Steele?
Well, I asked biodiversity, and crops are definitely part of that. The animal, wildlife, insects are a huge part of that, especially if they move to different areas where the temperatures are different, and then they have no natural predators. Then you end up with an ecological system that's all out of whack. It certainly is a huge issue in the oceans as well, changing different temperatures in the ocean. You end up with different migration patterns. You end up with different breeding patterns, and the whole is a compounding effect there in which is why I described it as an ecological holocaust. So that's interesting. Hey, so John, do you think that sea levels are changing? Which way are they going, and what impact does that have on nations?
Well, yes, I do believe the sea level is changing. I believe water is rising. There's plenty of cities where the water's getting higher, and they say eventually going to have to move. I forget, I was just reading the other day on one of the capitals of one of the cities is going to have to move their capital because it's been slowly sinking and the water's getting higher. So, I mean, we see it happening. We know that the polar bears have a hard time with their whole sink's taking off. They used to expect winter and ice at a certain time, and now the ice comes later, and it's not as, I guess that's down in Antarctica, I believe. And the ice comes later, and it doesn't go as far, so they have to swim further, and it's a mess that I think people are just being blinding themselves to, or just ignoring. You know, what's that old joke? They're in denial. You know, they're in denial. The joke used to be that they're Ramsey, the king of the denial. You know, so it's seen and people see it. I mean, there's even below me in the Chesapeake Bay, there's little islands with houses on it that the water's been coming up every year and it's getting higher, and they know eventually the island's not going to be there. I mean, we can't just close our eyes and say, oh, the ground is sinking. The water's definitely coming up, you know?
Daniel, is the sea level changing? Which way is it going, and what impact does that have on people?
Well, the sea level is certainly changing. It's getting higher. John gave the example of the Arctic and polar bears being negatively affected. That's absolutely true, and I can actually share an anecdotal example of this. Some polar bears have actually been migrating from the Arctic into Alaska and Canada, and there they interbreed with grizzly bears, creating polar bear grizzly bear hybrids. This is in exceedingly rare cases, but I mention them because they're dangerous. I mean, if you see a polar bear wandering into a very northern Canadian village, I mean, I'm sorry, I would have to faint from fear if that ever happened to me. But the main concern with the ocean is that not only is it rising, it's rising unsustainably. I mean, on a global scale, humanity depends on the oceanic ecosystem. And when the composition of the water changes, because not only is the sea level rising, but it's also depleting its nutrients due to a lack of plankton blooms and algal blooms. You know, when this kind of stuff happens, human beings lose major sources of food, major sources of resources, and major sources of income. So I think an optimal method of combating this is what's called ocean iron fertilization, where on an artificial, not an artificial level, but in an artificial way, one may collect, theoretically, large deposits of iron and seed the ocean with them, especially along coastlines. This will cause a mass bloom of algae, plankton, and krill, which are all organisms that are at the bottom of the aquatic food chain. This would in turn cause an increase in fish and other aquatic life, and that benefits us not only as stewards of a planet we care about, but also on the level of capitalism and increasing resources and income. So that's the best, that's the best of both worlds.
Yeah, a little man-made eutrophication. That's kind of nice. Yeah, I like that.
Exactly, yeah.
We're gonna go heavily into technology and solutions at the end, near the end, but that's really good. I like that addition, so because we're gonna forget otherwise. So that's really good. Yeah, I totally agree that there are technological solutions to a lot of these issues, and that increasing aquatic stocks is absolutely important. Because you have to start, as you said, from the bottom of the food chain and go up, because we're at the top of the food chain, and we've been removing those fundamental top layers, and now it's kind of just out of whack. So what was I was going to talk about? I was going to say Bangladesh is something that people talk about. When they talk about rising sea levels, there's 8 million people that are at risk there. It's going to cause a massive climate refugee crisis, which puts strain on all of the geopolitical regions in that area. So geopolitics, I wanted to ask you about geopolitics. Some of these nations, according to you guys, are going to disappear. Tonga, Samoa, Cook Islands, Micronesias. Not that they didn't already get bombed the hell out of by nuclear testing, but forget about that part. But these little nations are going to disappear, and somewhere like Bangladesh with, Dakar or whatever its capital's called, 8 million people, which are going to be inundated by rising sea levels. Geopolitics, those are just some examples, but geopolitics, John, I'll go the other way. Daniel, geopolitics, because you know about this. Geopolitics, how are nations going to be impacted by changing climate?
That's a really good question. Resource wars and economic warfare are enormous contributors to war and international conflict. For example, we're seeing, since you mentioned Bangladesh, that's one of the countries I mention in the paper I wrote when I specifically talk about the future of farmers and how they're going to be affected on the Asian continent. I mean, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India are all at the epicenter of this. They're being hit harder than a lot of other countries around them. And there's a large population in Bangladesh right now that is officially stateless. Its home territory or indigenous territory is heavily disputed. It's called the Rohingya. And the Rohingya is a population that's flooding into Bangladesh from neighboring countries en masse. They're predominantly Muslim, and that alienates them from other peoples around them, since they're pouring in from Bangladesh into nearby Buddhist Myanmar. And the Buddhists in Myanmar are reacting aggressively, in some cases with terrorist attacks. And what the Buddhists in Myanmar, specifically, I'll give you an example. There's a leader of a terrorist organization in Myanmar of radical Buddhists, which, as a San Francisco Buddhist-loving, child of a hippie environment, is completely baffling to me. But these radical Buddhists, led by an extremist monk named Ashington Wiratu, blame Muslims for coming into their countries without wondering why they're coming in the first place. If you want to understand why people move from one area to another, that primarily has to do with income and with acquisition of resources. And the Rohingya, they're extremely lacking in resources. They're some of the most, deprived economically peoples in Southeast Asia. They live in refugee camps. They're in tremendous poverty. Oftentimes, you have families with starving children and people with no place to go. If you want to understand why populations are moving like this and what's provoking reactionary backlash, it all has to do with resource wars.
Thank you for that. John. Oh, sorry. Did I cut somebody off? John, geopolitics.
A couple things I wanted to say here. We were talking about before the ice melting and stuff, and one of the things that I wanted to put in there quick about that is when the ice melts also, opens up possibility of gases that have been trapped in the ice and in the ground under it, like in the Antarctic, to be released that can even make the situation even worse just from that ice melting itself. Now, the interesting thing about changing of the geopolitics Yeah, that's going to be greatly changed. If the land changes, land submerged, the other possibility is there could be the possibility that places that are now desert could become uh, lush again, and you could farm it again because there's water. But that's going to make a lot of people move and change grounds, and there's going to be a lot of fighting, and it's going to be about one group wanting to live, and then another group that's holding its ground, not wanting to be invaded. And that's kind of the story of how man's always been. Uh, like when I was over in Tibet, it was interesting to me because the Tibetans, I could see exactly how they really were the same as some of the Indians in Arizona and some of the South Americans. And originally they were nomadic, and they traveled to grow their plants and to farm, and they would move where the soil was better and everything. And you're going to probably see more of that as the land changes. And they're only going to do it to try and survive. But there's going to be a lot of territory wars, and there's going to probably be territory wars like we haven't seen for a while because of that. But it's only going to be like Dan said. I mean, the fighting monks aren't necessarily going to be like, oh, why are you doing this, or ask questions. They're going to be defending their land. And it's funny when you think of monks that you don't necessarily think of fighting monks, but as Steele knows, I trained at the Shaolin Temple, and up there you have what they classify themselves as fighting monks. So there are some monks that are fighting monks. They're not just meditating all day long. Yeah. But I think it's going to take. It could possibly reverse us in time to a state when maybe borders are shifting very fast, depending on how the rise of the water increases. And the fear could be that as it escalates, it could escalate faster, which would cause more of that problem to happen at a quicker pace than people realize or think it could.
Well, I mean, it was massive in the 2016 election. Trump's building a wall, right? And why is he building a wall? It's not because he's building a wall because he wants to keep drug runners out. It's because in the future, you're going to have millions and millions of people bashing on the door because there is no environment left. There's nowhere else to go. It's going to be Fortress North America, and either you're on that one side of the wall or on the other, which talks about culprits and who's to blame. And let's switch to that. Is it government's fault, or is it CEOs? Is it Exxon? Is it capitalism? Is it a system? Is it the death of communism? Would communism have got us out of this impasse? John, who's to blame? Is it corporations? Is it legal? Is it humanity as a whole? Is it our selfish genes? I mean, who's to blame?
I like the selfish gene. Is that Levi or Lee and Strauss, or what is that? But actually, I think you hit on something. That selfish genes might be an interesting way to put it. I think it's basic human nature. I think we are very territorial, and we are very, I like the term that a lot of people have been using more, is tribal. We very much want to protect what we feel is ours and don't want to let somebody else in or share with people, which I think is funny, especially like in America, because we were built on supposedly that was the basis of our country. But I think there's a deep ingrained territorialness to man, which I hate to say it, but seems to me to be probably pretty primitive, an evolutionary thing that's still there. And I think that people will fight it's just a territorial thing. I mean, I think it's just an inbred genetic thing that I think as human beings we should try and fight. But I think it's just something that's in our nature, to be honest with you. I mean, we could cause all kinds of other reasons and stuff, but I think man basically is territorial. And like I said before, I think one of my weird ideas is the fact that I think when we are on the moon, when we are on Mars, I think people on Earth then will unite more, because then we're looking at it as those people on the moon, those people on Mars. But we're only uniting because of our territorialness now has changed and has expanded. You know, now it's not, us people from the United States, or, I mean, the United States is the United States. So we have states. So somebody could say, hey, I don't like this person from that state, you know, or you hear people say different things about a person from this state or that state. But I think I hate to admit it though, but it's just something in our nature that we have to fight. It's what causes us to go against other religions. It's what causes us to go against other nationalities. We just have something in us that's very territorial. And I don't think it's a good thing, but I think it causes a lot of trouble and it causes a lot of political problems.
Daniel, your insights on who's to blame? Is it corporations, governments, selfish genes, human nature?
Well, I primarily agree with John's assessment of human nature. We are certainly territorial animals, and that's only going to be exacerbated by resource scarcity. The thing about animals, the thing about the human animal, is that it inherently becomes more aggressive with a lack of resources. I like how Thomas Hobbes put this, that human nature is nasty, brutish, and short. And in order to circumvent the nastiness, brutishness, and shortness of human nature, when you have warring factions, when you have warring tribes, conflict between states, civil war, territorial disputes, or in the case of Trump's wall, as you mentioned, when you have migrants from one country to another being stopped at the border, I mean, not only is that not sustainable, but the unsustainability of these dynamics are no coincidence. These are primarily resource wars, and they're only going to get worse as time goes by. For example, look at the 2016 elections in the United States and surrounding elections in a lot of European countries. The election of Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom, the Balkans, Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, many countries across the African continent. It's all the same phenomenon where people are banding together on the basis of a populist impulse, where they look around and they say, we are the people, we stand for such and such a language and such a culture, and therefore we need to stick together. And that motivates people to act on what is fundamentally economic anxiety. And frankly, at the risk of sounding alarmist, and obviously this needs a lot of further qualification, but this is similar to what led up to World War II, where there was a great deal of economic anxiety and a strong lack of resources across Western Europe. Just as today, there's increasing food insecurity and a lot of resource scarcity in North America, between North America and Central America, and in many other parts of the world. You've got people acting on a basic need to survive, and that motivates people to aggression. And I think the wall at the Mexican border, a lot of populist impulses, they all come from resource wars. So if we can safeguard our resources effectively and come across the political aisle to talk about how best to feed our kids, then that's going to solve a lot of problems in the long run.
Yeah, I like that. I like that how you both focus on the core issue, which is human nature, because that's an incredibly important core, because it actually goes out to the other things that I tried to mention. Government and corporations and all of that become extensions of human nature. So actually, it's a really a good, solid answer from you guys on that front. All right,
let me interject two things here. One thing that was interesting to me about what Dan said, and I think there is a concern there, because we think of this as an environmental and a climate issue, but it could be something that could lead to a third world war without us realizing it at the time, because you have so much need and being in a state of panic. I think it would be an easy time for a leader to take over and guide them in a direction that they probably wouldn't naturally go because of their desperateness. Something interesting about the wall, though, that I think is interesting about present day, not looking towards the future a little bit, is I know that I've been in on phone calls and meetings about the environment and getting people to build more green buildings, and they have a shortage of workers. People don't want to go out and work for that wage to build buildings in this country. We have a problem with getting people to drive trucks because they don't want the wages. They want more money for less work. And it's interesting to me, because I kind of joke, we want to build a wall and keep the Mexicans out. But I think the Mexicans would probably be happy building green buildings and driving trucks for us, and making the money that the Americans we have here don't want to work for right now. So it's like it's a workforce that we could use to help us with issues, but we're putting up a wall instead of somehow figuring out how to better integrate them in their system. And I think that's the thing that man has to work towards too, is not always trying to keep people away, but to properly integrate people when they come in to what your country is doing and stuff. I think that's why we have the resistance. We feel in the United States, I think they feel in this day, I hear a lot of old immigrants talk about new immigrants, and they feel that the new immigrants don't want to become part of the country. You hear the old immigrants coming about how when they came to America, they wanted to learn English. They wanted to be American. And they get upset over the newer immigrants that don't want to do that. So even old immigrants get mad at the new immigrants because of the difference. So there's some issues there that are just, like I said, again, human issues. I don't know. And I think when you look at corporations and you think of money, that again goes back to their territory. I think to some extent when people get certain rich, it's not about the money anymore. It becomes a territory thing. This is their stuff, and they don't want other companies getting in on it. And it's just, I don't know. I think it's some evil human genes, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, in Australia here, like our solution is just to withdraw from the United Nations because we're 25 million people and we've got a billion, almost 2 or 3 billion people up above us in terms of, and a lot of those are going to become refugees and we've got 25 million people, and they're scared that the United Nations is going to say, take these people in. I mean, in the case of Bangladesh, it's 8 million people. That's almost half our population, well, not half, but close enough, right? I mean, you add in all the old people, it's going to swamp our population. So these nationalist populist movements that Daniel was talking about, for example, are being built off fear of future fear that we're locking ourselves into contracts that is going to sink our country, and we don't want that. So we have to withdraw now, which means that there's a motivation there, a stimulus there to accelerate, this nationalist feeling. Hey, so I wanted to switch gears really quickly because we're running out of time. Let's just quickly talk about the rainforest, the Amazon and North African fires, Congo and such. I can't remember who it was up to, but John, can you talk about your concerns about the Amazon fires, Bolsonaro, the agriculture going on there, and North African fires? Is it a problem?
Yeah, that definitely is a problem. And like I said earlier, I think that's another thing that's set off by greed a lot. And what I heard was the president was pushing people, not our president, but I guess that's Brazil, about the land and burning it so they can develop it. And even after the loggers cut down the trees, burning it to develop it, they're making it into more farmland, building stuff on it and stuff. And people don't realize how that lush forest has diversified life and how it helps with the ecology and everything. And they just don't care. And it's about the bottom dollar. They want to see make the money now and not think about the future. And that is a pity. I don't know what we can do about it exactly. It's just, again, man's greed.
All right. And Daniel, the Amazon, Bolsonaro, North African fires?
Yeah. I would say these various phenomena, and I can think of several phenomena that were similar that happened across the African continent a while back. I'm thinking specifically of the intervention of Shell and Exxon in the resources of Nigeria. They're all symptoms of the same thing. See, we used to have a global rhythm prior to the World Wars and the Great Depression of free trade and globalization, where it was safe to have a country develop its own resources and negotiate with another country to share and distribute those resources across countries and in some cases across international waters. Nowadays, things are looking a little different. You have CEOs of companies like Chevron and Burger King, which are two companies that are, by the way, involved in resource production in the Amazon rainforest, leveraging their corporate interests in order to intentionally set ablaze the Amazon rainforest and to develop it for their own purposes. I mean, Chevron needs that space in order to set up oil refineries and produce gasoline. Burger King needs that space in order to farm cattle, which is a huge burden on the earth when it comes to climate change. And these are all symptoms of abuses of the powers of corporations across international borders. If we were able to set up free trade agreements that were mutually agreed upon and sustainable, we wouldn't have these abuses. And examples of abuse of rights of other peoples abroad is going to get worse before it gets better. And given the fact that people generally tend to riot and start revolutions in situations such as these, as the African continent and especially the Middle East have shown us time and time again, I have a feeling that this is going to get worse before it gets better. And if we want to prevent that from happening, we need to hold the greediest and the most overreaching in our society accountable.
All right, John, so you got 30 seconds for this answer. Just make this one real quick. Do you think GDP is a good metric for analyzing the economy?
It's probably as good as right now. I'm not really sure how best to do it myself, to tell you the truth. So sometime it's probably the best until something better comes along.
Daniel, do you think GDP is a good metric for analyzing the economy?
I would say no, and here's why. GDP, or gross domestic product, is a unit of measurement for economic production on an annual scale. Now, a human being is a volatile and unstable creature, whereas a human being might produce $10,000 worth of resources for a given corporation, for example, in a single year. The next year, maybe a person's production rate might go down for personal reasons. Maybe a very effective worker might get sick and need to go on a number of days of paid leave. Maybe a person will want to start a family. Maybe there will be external factors that lead to their job loss, for example, layoffs, like what happened in 2008. So I think GDP is a good measurement of effective economic production to a point. That point is when the economy intervenes in the sustainability of the workforce. When certain economic changes alienate members of the workforce and cause mass layoffs and recessions, then GDP isn't so useful anymore. Then it becomes more useful, for example, to measure capitalism from the perspective of the human worker. Now, that's not a populist or elitist message. I'm just arguing for a different unit of analysis.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So,
hey, sorry, John.
Well, my question is, what would you guys, both of you guys, recommend yourselves as an alternative?
I'll start. I really am a fan of Andrew Yang's human-centered capitalism model. And if you're not familiar with presidential candidate Andrew Yang, he specifically talks about some of the problems we mentioned earlier, where John specifically were saying that truck drivers oftentimes don't want to drive trucks anymore. Well, that causes mass layoffs, which in turn causes low production of resources. So if we want to prevent that, we should provide for the bottom line in a way that encourages and stimulates hard work. A good way to do that is to measure economic growth by the well-being of the average family. That would be my recommendation.
My recommendation would be to amalgamate other metrics into a system. So not GDP anymore, but like for example, Andrew Yang, as Daniel was pointing out, he always talks about the fact that looking after your autistic son or something is not counted into GDP. It's not wealth. There's nothing there. I mean, that should be added into. So global happiness. There's wealth outside of a finished product as well. There's natural wealth. Preserving natural wealth and species, preserving a species in terms of the climate. There's other metrics that need to go into a more healthy statistical number that produces your economy. I think your economy is much more dynamic, much more fluid, and it's talking about wealth, not just finished goods and services. And the reason is because capitalism 1.0 is dead in the water, because you can't have capitalism 1.0 because you get the government every single time. The government is always going to come along. The corporations are never just beholden to their customers and their shareholders, okay? And it really, capitalism 1.0 just says customers, okay? And that would work in a great world where the incentives are flipped, and creating rainforests and biodiversity was profitable because your customers demand that. But that's not what's happening. The incentives are flipped on their head. And they get flipped on their head even harder because you've got governments in the way that incentivize and subsidize cheap Kardashev, below Kardashev 1 scale energy sources, old dead plants and dead dinosaurs, and it's for fuel and stuff like this. We're talking about very primitive, wood. People use wood for their fire to heat their homes. I mean, this is super primitive stuff. So my answer is basically, it has to be a much more dynamic, much more holistic. It has to have a lot more metrics thrown into to calculate your GDP, and seen and unseen work, not just finished products, work that goes on in the home, work that goes on digital fronts and digital surfaces as well, that that people don't talk about, which only usually get reflected in a stock market price of a company like Microsoft or Yahoo. That can be across 3 different share markets. So there's definitely an argument there that the economy is much more dynamic. All right, so let's talk about tech. Daniel, can you open us up and just tell us quickly, with the time we have left, on some technology solutions that could be implemented today and that are just coming down, very coming down, carbon sequestration and others, breathable concrete, biodegradable plastic, etc., etc. What's some technological solutions that we could see that could help to put some of these issues off even further?
Sure. Well, as I talk about in my paper in the Transhumanism Handbook, carbon sequestration and carbon capture technologies are some of the most optimal ways to prevent this problem from being exacerbated further. That would involve a carbon sequestration plant roughly the size of a small house or a small building that would siphon CO2 from the atmosphere and either store it in pockets underground, or with appropriate innovation, there could even be developments in something Chinese technology is doing now, where carbon dioxide can be filtered from the atmosphere, condensed into a brick, a hard block of carbon, and used as a usable construction material. I mean, think about the opportunity we have here for recycling. We could siphon CO2 out of the atmosphere, condense it into blocks of carbon, and use that to build houses. And given the fact that I live in San Francisco, around me and a lot of other, places similar to this, housing is a very hot button issue. A lot of people believe that housing is really on the decline around here, and what little housing there is being charged too excessively. Very briefly, I'll also mention that I'm a big fan of thorium power. Now, thorium power is a lot like your basic traditional nuclear power, but instead of using uranium, it uses a similar radioactive element with a longer half-life. So it would take a much longer time to become radioactive. And a thorium fuel cycle could produce more power than your basic uranium nuclear power. So I endorse that as well.
Fantastic. John Kurtz, Carrots, sorry.
No, that's fine.
Technological solutions.
Something I wanted to say on Dan's, actually, it was a conversation I had with a workmate this week on nuclear power plants. And I had worked for EPA monitoring 3 Mile Island and had a full year of nuclear engineering when I was working on my master's. And I do like nuclear power, but we talked about the fact that the technology they really use in nuclear power plants is kind of to be a symbiosis with the military, because the military wanted to be able to use the byproducts. That's kind of the reason we didn't go to the other technology, was again a military greed kind of thing, where they could use some of the byproducts of the present technology for weapons if they needed to. So that's kind of an interesting point of why they didn't go to the other technology and they used the present technology for nuclear power plants. The other thing that I wanted to mention about technology is the cloud seeding, where you seed the clouds to make them a little bit more reflective, to actually cool the earth. One of the major concerns I have with them doing that is the fact that if you start cooling the earth by seeding the clouds, not the clowns, but the clouds, to reflect the clowns are the ones in politics. I'm sorry, but that they might say, hey, well, the temperature's down now. We don't have to clean up the CO2 or clean up the methane or the other problems because, hey, the temperature's fine. So that's the concern with doing that. But I think that might also be one of the factors they have to do along with taking the carbon out of the air, and also to try and make it is, but I've seen some of the laws that they're trying to push and some of the things, and they say by this year we want this. And to tell you the truth, the numbers they're showing are probably not enough to help us. A lot of times you find what the politicians are trying to push let's be honest. The problem with politics is you have to weigh. You can't say, hey, we got to do this environmental thing. It always comes to the fact that they say, hey, well, there's these many jobs at stake, and this person will be out of work if you do this. So I find a lot of the policies that they are writing, although they mean well, they're probably way too slow and are not going to be fast enough to save us. So we have to do more, and we have to do a bunch of different things at the same time.
I do actually address that in my paper, where specifically the statistics show that if we invest in carbon capture today, this year or the next year, very soon, there is a possibility with 7 to 8 figures of investment, decreasing the severity of climate change and actually reducing its severity by 2020. But if we keep doing what we're currently doing, if we keep pushing for carbon taxes and carbon sequestration, cap and trade, carbon taxes and cap and trade policies instead of carbon sequestration, then by 2025, at the very earliest, there could be only a slight change. And even then, that wouldn't reduce the emissions that are already in the atmosphere. So I talk about that more in the paper that I published in the Transhumanism Handbook, but we're definitely going to have to talk about this more because there's a lot of ground to cover.
Yeah, there definitely is. We didn't even talk about the Gulf Stream and some of the other things that are happening. John Kurtz, I thought you might mention 3D printing, since you're a big fan of 3D printing. 3D printing will disrupt global shipping. Global shipping is a horrible form of trade, especially. In the 1800s. Yes. It took a lot of wood. If you had reforested that area, it might have been somewhat sustainable. But today, you've got one of the most inefficient methods of world trade, and that holds literally the world together. It's the glue that holds the world together at the expense of everything else, right? And yes, there's China-U.S. trade wars and tariffs and things, but that only exacerbates other issues like the military sphere and things like that. So,
the 3D printing, we touched on that briefly last time we talked, and how basically companies like you dial into or get on your phone to Amazon, and you won't buy a product, you buy the program to how you build the product with your 3D printer. The only other thing is, though, the 3D printers still take whatever you want to call it, goop or whatever to print. I guess you call it ink. I'm not sure. What do you call it for a 3D printer? But that still has to be made somewhere and shipped. So you're going to find then they're going to be shipping that. So there's still going to be some shipping probably somewhere. It's just going to change, but there's still going to be shipping. They're going to have to deliver those containers of whatever it is you're printing from, and depending on what you're printing, you're going to need a different goop. I don't know what's a good name for that goop, but it's not necessarily ink, but it's. So I mean, there's still going to have to be some shipping and some delivering, and I don't know what that's exactly going to look like. One thing we talked about last time was the fact that Dan touched on it a little bit is I do believe in a global economy. I do believe the countries have to work better together. I think the factor that we don't want to work together goes back to our nasty genes of wanting to be territorial. But I think some of the shift right now with the United States, with England, and with Russia, they're trying to pull back and be themselves again when they were getting more global. And I think you find with sometimes people, when they see a change, it makes them kind of detract or retaliate to it. So they saw us going global and they pulled back. We don't want to be global. We want to be, make America strong again, make Russia strong again. They pull back from it because I think we were kind of heading in a nice global direction there for a little bit. And now we've all kind of wanted to pull back. I think some of our solutions is to be more global and to open up our gates and trade more and realize certain areas are better for certain things and stuff. And I think that would alleviate a lot of problems.
All right, thank you. Well, I want to thank you both for coming on Detonation. We're going to wrap that up. I know you're both got to run. You're very busy men doing busy things, whatever you guys do. So thank you so much for coming on Detonation. And look, we're gonna have Meow here, but we'll do this again with Meow because he's a very interesting guy, quite famous here in Australia. He's got labs and all sorts of cool stuff going on. Biohacker. Very cool stuff. And there's a party down here called the Science Party, which is also really interesting and get some amazing guests on. But it's absolute pleasure and honor to be talking with you both again today. And I'm glad we could do it in this sort of format, so that you could cross converse, and that's much nicer. So we'll come back on again at some point with Meow. Definitely. He'll be back soon. It's the Pope spoke about the climate. The religions all think that this is an issue. Religions think it's an issue. Obviously the Buddhists are getting faced with it. The economists are worried about it because it's impacting global economy. The geopolitical strategists and the military is worried about it because there's going to be a huge refugee crisis. And what does that mean for security? Who are these people? What's their motivations? If you're in the nationalist side of things, for example, if you're in Europe and you say, hey, I don't want all these people coming up from Syria, well, that's a war zone, or Pakistan or Afghanistan or wherever there's climate issues all coming up. If those countries didn't have a climate issue, they wouldn't be coming up. And then, ISIS couldn't smuggle, or whoever couldn't smuggle, terrorist threats in the climate refugees mob. So, it doesn't matter what you look at, what scenario or situation you come at the climate issue from, whether it's technology or security or economic or whatever, it's an exacerbating problem. And I mean, you can dig your head in the sand and you can build a wall, but that actually ends up not helping you because you end up in the moral disposition of knowing what you're doing. And so, But all right, cool. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Great to be here.
All right. Detonation, all more coming all your way all this week.